So in this video we are going to talk about the tongue and its structure and the internal structure mainly. And when we consider about the tongue, it's a muscular organ which is formed from a bulk of muscles, and it mainly involves in speech, mastication, and also reception of taste. And when we consider about the tongue, it mainly can be divided into three parts. The anterior most part is the apex, the middle, the bigger part is called the body or the corpus linguae, and the most posterior part is the radix or the root of the tongue, through which it attaches to the inferior structures. Mainly it get attached to hyoid bone and the mandible. So when we consider about the superior surface or the surface facing the palate, it's called the dorsum or the dorsal surface, and here is the inferior surface of the tongue. And when you consider about the superior surface, it can be mainly divided into as a anterior 2/3 of the tongue and posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And the line of demarcation between those two portions is the sulcus terminalis, which is a V-shaped line. It's like this, and it's starting from the place just in front of the foramen caecum. It's right here, you can see. It's a remnant of the place where the tibular structure from which the thyroid isthmus develops in the childhood, and right in front of it the sulcus terminalis starts and goes forward and laterally like this in a V shape. So this is a line of demarcation between anterior and the posterior part. So anterior part, when you consider about anterior part, it is kind of rough due to the presence of papillae, which are the main function of those are reception of taste. And the posterior 1/3 is kind of smooth, not as rough as the anterior part, but it has a bulging appearance due to the presence of lingual tonsils. And when you consider about lingual tonsils, it's included in a specific group of lymphoid aggregations, which is in a circular arrangement in the throat, and it consists of two paired tonsils and two unpaired ones. And lingual tonsils is here, so it's basically like this. Okay, this is a lingual tonsils, and behind that there are paired palatine tonsils, and behind that there's paired tubarale tonsils, and on the upper surface, right somewhere here in the base of the skull, it's pharyngeal tonsils, or we call it adenoids. So that's about it. And back to the anterior surface. And I forgot one thing. This specific aggregation of lymphoid tissue is called as Waldeck-Pirogov's ring, because it's in a circular arrangement. And now let's come back to the anterior surface of the tongue, which I said it has a rough appearance due to the presence of papillae. And when we consider about papillae, there are four main types of papillae. The first one is filiform or the conical papillae. They are mostly aggregated in the anterior part of the tongue, and they are very small and they are very numerous, and their main function is they act as tactile organs. And the second type of papillae is the fungiform papillae. They are also present in the anterior part and also at the margins of the tongue. The third type is valate papillae. Previously I mentioned about sulcus terminalis, and right in front of sulcus terminalis you can see in a linear arrangement somewhat bigger circular shaped structures. These are the valate papillae, and this is the only place where you can find them. When you consider about their structure, they are can come closer. You can see there's a like central cylindrical part in the middle, and then followed by a groove. There is a ring surrounding it. And the third type of papillae is the foliate papillae. This is located at the lateral margins of the tongue. You can see here in like folds, that's why they're called foliate papillae. Except for the first type, filiform or conical papillae, all the other three, fungiform, valate, and foliate papillae, all their function is to receive taste sensations from the chemicals. So I'll come back to the radix for a while, and at the end of the root of the tongue, you can see the epiglottis here, and the tongue is attached to the epiglottis through three folds. You can like from here, one in the middle and two from here. These are called glossoepiglottic folds. Glossoepiglottic, that means they are like going from tongue to the epiglottis. The middle one is called the plica glossoepiglotica mediana, and those two and the either sides are called the same name, lateralis. So in between those folds you can see valleculae, those two fossas. So that's basically everything about you have to know about the external structure of the tongue. So let's move into the internal structure, which is basically a bulk of muscles, and I'll explain about the muscles. So now we'll come to the muscles of the tongue, and there are mainly two classifications, two ways that we can classify the muscles of the tongue. The first one is kind of a basic one where we can classify them as extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic means those muscles have connections outside of the tongue, and intrinsic means they are muscles which are embedded within the body of the tongue, so they don't have any connections outside of the tongue. So as the extrinsic muscles have connections outside of the tongue, which are basically bones, more specifically we can say the styloid process, hyoid bone, mandible. So as they are having connections outside of the tongue, their contractions result in change of position. And when you consider about the intrinsic muscles, because they are solely embedded within the body of the tongue, their contraction doesn't result in a change of position but change of shape. So their function is to change the position of the tongue, and their function is to change the shape of the tongue. And extrinsic muscles, there are four: genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus, and palatoglossus. And by the name, genioglossus means genio means chin, so from chin to the tongue. Hyoglossus means from hyoid bone to the tongue. Styloglossus means from styloid process to the tongue. Palatoglossus means from palate to the tongue. And intrinsic muscles, there are again four: superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal. This is not longus or something. This is longitudinal, superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal, transversalis, and verticalis. But this classification is a basic one because each of these muscles can't function individually. So we have another classification which is mainly based on the development of these muscles. So there are again three types. The first one, these muscles originate from the derivatives of the first visceral arch. You don't have to know about all the development stuff, but you have to remember this name. They originate from the derivatives of the first visceral arch, second visceral arch, and third visceral arch. So to make it easier to remember, you can remember as first visceral arch. That group they are the main muscles which originate from the mandible. The second group, second visceral arch, they are the muscles originate from styloid process and the lesser horn of the hyoid bone. You have to mention that not lesser horn of hyoid bone. And third group, third visceral arch, is the body and the greater horn of again hyoid bone. So the first visceral arch, the muscles originate from first visceral derivatives of first visceral arch. There are two: genioglossus and verticalis. Second group, there are three: styloglossus, superior and inferior longitudinal. And the third group, we have three: hyoglossus, palatoglossus, and transversalis. Now let's go for a kind of diagrammatic interpretation, so to get a more precise understanding. So this is a sagittal section, and that's a frontal section of the tongue. So let's consider the first. I'll go with this classification to make more sense. First group, from the mandible, we have two muscles: genioglossus and verticalis. Now you might wonder what the connection between genioglossus and verticalis to be in the same group. That's because so the genioglossus, I said previously, genioglossus means it goes from the mandible to the tongue. So here's the genioglossus. You can see this is the mandible, and right in the middle there's mental spine. That's where it originates from. So it goes from the mental spine all the way, like in a circular pathway, to the tongue upwards. So where the verticalis comes into action is like when these genioglossus fibers goes upward, you can see the fibers take more of a vertical position. So continuation of these fibers upward is the musculus verticalis. So it's kind of a same muscle but given two names. Once again, genioglossus, it originates from the mental spine and goes somewhat like circular pathway, and once it like reaches a vertical position, we call it musculus verticalis. In the frontal plane, you can see it as like this. Right, here's the genioglossus coming like this, and then it goes in a vertical position, and it goes all the way somewhat closer to the ventral surface, or sorry, dorsal surface, superior surface of the tongue, and that's why we call it as musculus verticalis. And let's go to the second group. We have three muscles. Sorry, 1 minute back I forgot about the function. So genioglossus and verticalis, when the genioglossus is the biggest muscle and it makes the bulk of the tongue. So when this muscle gets contracted, what happens to the tongue is it moves forward and flatten. You can see the force comes like this. So imagine these are the teeth, mandibular incisors, and when the tongue is like this, when this muscle get contracted, the tongue moves forward and it gets flattened, right? So the second group is styloglossus, superior and inferior longitudinal muscles. In this sagittal view, we can't see many of that. Let's go to the frontal plane. And styloglossus. Styloglossus means it comes from styloid process to the tongue. And superior and inferior longitudinal ones is superior longitudinal. You can see, like, I've drawn it in a circular way because it goes longitudinally. So you cut it in cross section, you can see fibers like this. So superior longitudinal and inferior longitudinal is right here. So these muscles, as you can see, the fibers are almost parallel to the direction of the tongue. When these muscles get contracted, the force is coming like this. So the function of these muscles, styloglossus, I said, it coming from styloid process to the tongue. And inferior and superior and inferior longitudinal muscles, they originate from the lesser horn of the hyoid bone, and they pass parallel in either sides of the septum. You know, tongue is a parallel organ which is divided into two halves by median septum. So these two muscles go parallel, like if you see from the above, if this is septum, these two muscles go in either sides of it, parallel to this septum, all the way to the tip of the tongue. So contraction of these muscles pull the tongue backward. Inferior superior longitudinal muscles pull the tongue backward, and styloglossus, because these muscles comes from above, like upper position, contraction of these muscles pulls the tongue upward as well. So backward and upward. Let's move into the third group, which has three muscles: hyoglossus, palatoglossus, and transversalis. Hyoglossus, you can see the hyoid bone here. I mentioned earlier, these muscles originate from the body and the greater horns of the hyoid bone. So hyoglossus is originate from here and almost goes in a vertical position and attached to the sides of the tongue. And palatoglossus and transversalis. Transversalis, by the name you can tell transversalis. They originate from the middle septum and goes to the either sides of, like, goes in opposite way towards the edges of the, or the margins of the tongue. And palatoglossus is the continuation of this transverse muscle. Like we had a similar incidence before with the genioglossus and verticalis. So this is something similar. Transverse muscles originate from the middle septum, goes to the either sides, and they continue as palatoglossus muscle. So in the real preparates, vertical and transverse muscles are like, they are somewhat embedded together. So they'll be like this. For the easier interpretation, I've drawn it like separately. In the real preparates, like in a live human body, these fibers are something like this. Okay. And the function of this muscle, transversalis. So you know their fibers are going away like this from the septum. Therefore, they have two functions. They can either contract unilaterally or they can contract bilaterally. If they contract unilaterally, you know the pull is coming like this, only to one side. So let's say this is the right side and this is left side. Let's say the right side transversalis muscle, that right portion is getting contracted, so it pulls the septum towards the right side. So its function is unilateral contractions pull the tongue to the side of contraction, and bilateral contraction, the force is coming towards the septum, so it makes the tongue like shorter, right? Yeah, that's pretty much about the internal structure.